Okay, sequence F, the bad guys close in. Ultimately, what we should understand about the story in general is that all of the different aspects and conflicts in the story are starting to move together. That they're starting to unfold in a way that they complicate one another. Because what we want by the end of the film is a climax. That's ultimately what we're working up to, a climax that really answers a lot of questions at one time. And for that to happen, all of these lines of conflict need to culminate into a singular point. A point where, what the main character is doing and trying to accomplish affects all of the storylines. And, we've been talking about how the story is a part of, it takes place in the mind of the audience. And, from the beginning of the film, we're putting pieces of story into their mind without revealing the relationship between them, because they don't really know what happens later in the film. The plan is to slowly reveal how these different storylines are related to one another, how they affect one another, and hopefully by the end of the film, in the climax, what the main character is doing and trying to accomplish affects all of the storylines, so that ultimately the answer at the end, what the main character accomplishes, answers all of these questions about the lines of conflict. And that's kind of important to talk about here in the sequence, because this sequence really begins to reveal how the main character, or how the main conflict is drawing the character into a personal battle. Things are getting personal for the main character. So let's pick up where we left off with sequence E and their attempt to try to address the problem more directly and resulting in ultimately a failure. In The Matrix, Neo is, they're trying to get out of the Matrix, and the agents have set a trap for them. Cypher is on the other end of the line, as it were, and he is threatening to pull the plug on everybody, and pulls the plug on a few people. But he's ultimately stopped, and both Trinity and Neo find their way out. And that ends that sequence, but the agents have Morpheus. And so, it's pretty clear at that point that, what Neo's objective is to save Morpheus. And I want to bring up also, the dramatic question again at this point. What do we understand the story is really about from the standpoint of the storyteller? What is the highest stakes in the story? In The Matrix, the story is about the last humans basically preserving their existence. That's the story. That's the main conflict of the film. And Morpheus is sort of the caretaker. He's sort of the gatekeeper. He's the one that's protecting Zion, which is the city that has the last remaining humans. He's the only one that stands between the robots and Zion. And as this protector, as this guardian is what he is, he's also searching for the ultimate weapon to defeat the robots, which he thinks is Neo. So what's happening in the story is the agents have Morpheus. They are threatening to try to pick his brain and find out how to get to Zion and basically wipe out the rest of humanity. And Neo, who now thinks he's responsible and is not going to, he's responsible for Morpheus' situation, is going to take it upon himself to try to save him. And that's what the next sequence is really about. It's a clear objective at this point, to rescue Morpheus, because that's what they need to do in order to protect humankind. So we're right on track with the main conflict in the story, but we'll see how things are getting personal for Neo as he's trying to solve the problem as he understands it. Personally, what happens is he starts to make a discovery for himself. He discovers that through his own action, through his own ambition, through his own determination, that he starts getting stronger and stronger. He gets out of his head a little bit. If he was put in his head by, say, Morpheus telling him, you're the one that's going to save everybody, his self-doubt. Well, in this moment, there's no room for doubt. He's not trying to prove he's the one. He's just trying to save Morpheus. And that sort of unlocks his potential in a sense. And the audience gets to see what he's capable of. And Trinity voices that. How did you do that? How were you able to do that? And this sequence ends with Neo ultimately saving, Morpheus. It's not the end of that's the end of that sequence, but, we sort of continue that action, and they still have to sort of get out. They still have to get out of the Matrix, and they haven't accomplished that yet. But they pull Morpheus out of the agent's control, and the next sequence, as we'll see in sort of this resurrection moment, and we'll talk about that in sequence G. What's at stake for Neo at that point. But they grab Morpheus, he escapes, and it's really just, at this point, he's accomplished his goal. As far as Neo is concerned, he saves Morpheus. And in his mind, he is now protecting Zion again. Morpheus could go back to doing his job, and the story is just kind of left with, it's now Neo versus the agents. And that's the personal story. We should always see that the dramatic question should be somewhat answered, or can be somewhat answered at this point in the story, but the story isn't over yet. The dramatic question's answered. Do they protect Zion? Yes, from the imminent threat that the agents sort of sprung on them. That has been foiled, and Morpheus is now back in his sort of equilibrium as far as protecting Zion. Now it's just Neo and his personal journey. What's at stake personally for him, and how he's going to handle and confront these agents. So that's kind of how that sequence F works for Jaws. For Matrix. For Jaws, it's another attempt to try to kill the shark, and they're raising the stakes a little bit, and they're pulling out another weapon, and that's when they start shooting these barrels into the shark, thinking that that's going to bring the shark up, and they can ultimately catch the shark. Well, the shark isn't having anything of it. And it's also the sequence, when we call it the bad guys close in, it's also the sequence where we really get a look at the shark for, a really good look at the shark for the first time. We see the enemy, the bad guys closing in, and we find out that, the shark, is more of an opponent than they ever could have imagined, because the shark is just as interested in killing them as they seem to be in killing the shark. So he shoots these barrels, the fish goes under, and it seems to be much stronger than they anticipated, and they realize at this point that they're going to have to do something else. What they've pulled out so far is not working. And the sequence is also ended by, we talk about things getting personal. The sequence ends with this moment with the guys all below deck and kind of sharing stories about these different shark tales. And it is a time when these guys sort of bond. We start to like Quint. Quint kind of goes from this really kooky, abrasive, and bossy guy to this guy who's got a real story behind him, and it makes him very empathetic at this point. And in this conflict between he and Hooper, there's always kind of been this ego conflict between these two. They sort of bond. They learn to respect one another. Chief Brody still feels a little bit like a third wheel, but he's there, and there's still this fear of the water that Chief Brody is confronting, and he's going to get to that real soon. But it's a bonding moment, and it makes the audience, it gives the audience this opportunity to feel like they are personally getting more involved in the story. They like these characters. They like all of them now, and that's an important point. You know, we must resolve some of these conflicts so that we can really raise the stakes in terms of the audience's feeling about wanting all of them to survive. That's a critical aspect to how this story is told, because it really just going to come down to man versus shark. I mean, that's what it's going to boil down to. How do we want the audience to feel about it, and what are we doing to help, you know, clarify for the audience how we want them to feel? So we're consolidating those sort of tension of the relationship storylines, these relationships and the conflicts between them. We want to resolve those in a way that the audience can get behind them. So that's ultimately sequence F, and it sort of lands in a moment where, especially in the Matrix, where the character is sort of on their own. They're resurrected. They're given some courage, some new courage, in terms of what they've accomplished so far, and what they've accomplished gives them sort of a second wind, a second take on the situation, you know, a new approach to really solving the problem, a more personal approach, because they now feel more personally involved, and it could be, you know, there's more at stake personally for these characters. So that's ultimately sequence F and how things unfold in that sequence. You know, and next we're going to move on to sequence G, which is, you know, we're getting close to the end of the story, and we'll see how some of this sequence G and sequence H is structured, and, you know, kind of the balance between the two. A sequence H, when we get to it, it's sometimes there's not much story there at all, simply because sequence H functions in a particular way that in some stories is unnecessary. But we'll get to that when we get to sequence H. Let's find out about sequence G, which is ultimately the final confrontation, the big confrontation in the story.